we get revolutions when a period of rising expectations is followed by rapid reversals. And I don't think it's any accident that I was taken with that theory as I was working on the book when we experienced the transition from Obama to Trump, right? And I saw echoes of those earlier developments in 68, 69 in, you know, what was going on around me as I was working on the book.
Thanks for doing this, Mark. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a great opportunity as far as I'm concerned.
What made you want to take this on? What made you do it, you know?
Well, there had been other books done on the Stonewall Riots, and I didn't want to repeat. Those are really good books. David Carter has one, and Martin Duberman has one. But I knew the 50th anniversary was coming up as we were approaching 2019. And so a couple of years before that, I started coming up with the idea, instead of a narrative history of Stonewall, which would really just be repeating what had been done, I could put together a collection of source materials from the time period. We love to do this in history classes, put the raw materials of history in our students' hands so that they can develop interpretations and they develop new ways of seeing things. But that really hasn't been done much in queer histories, and it hasn't been done for the Stonewall Riots. And people have all sorts of ideas, myths, and misconceptions about what happened there. But if they can go back to the Village Voice in 1969, the New York Times, the queer media of the era, the photographs, they can begin to sift through the interpretations that might be valid, the interpretations that might not be so valid. That of course left open a huge number of questions. When did I want to start? When did I want to finish?
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted to go chronologically, geographically, whose actions I wanted to prioritize, what sources I wanted to privilege. So there were a million questions still to be asked, but I set the basic parameters that it would be a collection of primary sources from the period, right at the outset.
So, a lot of times, a lot of people always say that's the beginning of the movement, but it's not really the beginning of the movement. What's the context for what leads up to that day?
Right. Well, historians, I would say, for 30 years have been trying to rebuff that myth that everything began with Stonewall, that the queer movement, the LGBT movement began in June 1969. So in my earlier career, my contribution to that was focus on the city of Philadelphia and look at developments in the 1940s, 50s, 1960s, leading up to and through the Stonewall era. And so my work and the work of dozens of other historians now have established that there was a movement in the 50s and 60s. It actually began in Southern California, in LA. And there were protests and demonstrations that were escalating in 65, 66, 67, 68. They really took a more radical turn in San Francisco in the spring of 1969, so several months before the Stonewall Riots erupted. So there is all this context, and rather than believing one of the myths is that the Queens were distressed because Judy Garland's funeral had taken place earlier that day, we can give that its due, but also explore the deeper roots of what happened in New York City and then what spread nationally and internationally.
Nationally at that time for queer folk was not a good time going into that. What was some of the energy around those days that sort of give context for why it would explode like that?
Right. Well, I think, again, a lot of the accounts of the LGBT movement basically portray everything before Stonewall as dark and dreary and everything after Stonewall as light and bright. And so it's certainly true that conditions were terrible, but I try to emphasize in the way I collected the materials, the sources, that there was actually a period of improvement in the 1960s for LGBT people, as was the case for women and racial minorities and various other groups. And especially in 66, 67, 68, there were positive developments. The first states decriminalized sodomy. New York City mayor announced that they would reduce or restrict police entrapment practices, which caught up many queer people. Other countries were decriminalizing sodomy. So there were various positive reforms. But right, I try to emphasize in the book that there were also ominous developments in late 68 and early 69. So of course we know about the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. We know about the escalation of the Vietnam War. But I think we can add to that the election of Nixon in November 68, his inauguration in January 69. I think there was this sense that the period of reform was over and that whatever gains had been achieved in the 60s, which were small but significant, I would say, for queer people, were threatened. And so that's why I make use of this political science theory that some people at the time invoked in 69 that said we get revolutions when a period of rising expectations is followed by rapid reversals. And I don't think it's any accident that I was taken with that theory as I was working on the book when we experienced the transition from Obama to Trump, right? And I saw echoes of those earlier developments in 68, 69 in what was going on around me as I was working on the book.
Now, at that time, we didn't know who the mayor would become, and we had a lot of anxiety around who it might be. It actually turned out well, but we didn't. What was the spirit like at that time in the bars?
No, I think that's what you're saying is absolutely right. So I got really interested. I'm a chronology nerd, and I noticed that the primary, the New York City mayoral primary, was occurred in the weeks leading up to Stonewall. And John Lindsay was a liberal Republican known as a reformist mayor, and part of this group of liberal New England Republicans that used to exist that are now few and far between. But he was basically primaried from the right and lost the Republican primary to be mayor of New York City. And there was a conservative Democrat who won the Democratic primary. So whether the Republican or the Democrat won, I think it just contributed to this feeling in the bars and more generally among disenfranchised communities in New York City that things were taking a turn for the worse. Now, what they didn't know was that Lindsay would decide to run on a third party and win. So things turned out better on the local level, although Lindsay was certainly a target of gay liberationists after 69 as they mobilized. But I think the mood in the bars, there were murders in LA and San Francisco and New York in the months leading up to Stonewall. There were these ominous political developments, and I think people were very much on edge. So there was that psychological character that had been described by some sociologists and political scientists as contributing to kind of what we might today call revolutionary emotion and anger.
That street, that Christopher Street sort of few blocks, which has, I lived on that street, it's a beautiful little area. What was it like then?
Well, it was right in the heart of Greenwich Village. So as you know, but not everyone might know, it's a part of New York City it's not filled with skyscrapers and finance and corporate headquarters. There are a lot of small and narrow streets with 3 and 4 and 5 store buildings. It has a neighborhood feel, and of course, Greenwich Village and that part of Greenwich Village had at least 100-year-old history of being a center of bohemianism and radicalism and the home of lots of immigrant groups over the years and important in the counterculture. And so some listeners may have a sense of it from one of the recent popular programs, The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. Of course, when she goes to perform in comedy clubs, she's going to the Village. So Sheridan Square, that neighborhood, had that character, and so there were probably a dozen or 2 dozen gay bars within 10 blocks of that that particular block where the Stonewall Inn was located. So it really was a center of activity.
Can I ask, the significance of the bars, and the importance of that and the gathering place, and just, could you speak to a little bit, given the time period?
Right. Well, I think some people have said that bars are to the gay world what churches were to the African-American world. And, that analogy doesn't totally hold, but there's something to it. It's just the idea that these were spaces of congregation, spaces where people could feel safe, come together, and sometimes develop new forms of consciousness and new forms of resistance. So there were few places where LGBT people could go in public or the quasi-public sphere and feel somewhat safe and protected. And bars were really critical in that era. Now, bars were also dangerous, right? But that contributed, I would say, to their appeal, because there was that sense of courting danger and something a little bit risky and edgy to go out to gay bars in that era. And there was also great diversity in gay bars. There were upper class piano bars serving fancy cocktails where people would still be dressed as was typical in bars in the 40s and 50s. But then there were, and Stonewall was more like this, there were dive bars where people would go very casually, and there was dancing and drugs and illicit activities of various kinds. The Stonewall fit that profile.
But the importance that you just said about, in a public space, and if you go to a church, it's more open. I mean, you're still, the windows are there, but this idea that this population didn't even feel like they could necessarily gather together, right? So even the kind of the metaphor of that, I think, is incredibly profound.
No, I think you're right to point that out. And it is useful to remember the condition of LGBT life in that period. People could be readily fired from their jobs if they were known to be queer. People were commonly rejected by their families, terminated from the military. The risks of physical violence, not to mention emotional abuse and harassment, was ever present. And people could not count on law enforcement for protection. And so when crimes were committed against LGBT people, there was a real question: do you bother to call the police, because you might end up further victimized in calling the police? So in that context, the bars, even though they might be dives, and at the Stonewall, apparently, the drinks were watered down. It was apparently completely unsanitary. There were risks of raids, as happened when the payoff system that involved the mafia and the police broke down. So there were all these risks. And the fact that hundreds or thousands of people went out in New York City, nightly to the gay bars, I think really underscores how precious a space gay bars were, right? Because they did come with these risks.
Even with the payoffs, there could be, there's a certain amount of political things where they just are going to raid they're going to raid because they have to, right? They have to get some number. Now, these bars were used to that. So what happened on this day, and who were some of the characters on this day that led to this? Like, just take us through the actual moments of it.
Right. Well, with the mayoral election coming, there was a likelihood of crackdowns on the gay bars. This happened in every election cycle in many, many American cities, because the incumbents like to portray themselves as tough on crime, as morally pure and virtuous. And so that was part of the context. The Stonewall Inn had a very negative reputation. It had been raided before. In fact, it was raided just days before the night that erupted into riots. There's a lot of different explanations of why that night and why the Stonewall. So one set of answers focuses on the real violations of law that were taking place, whether violations of health code, violations of liquor laws. So there's that set. There were allegations about prostitution and child prostitution and drugs and all those things. So there's that.
Didn't that come later? Like, what was the moment that the people in the bar needed to kick it off? It was just one time too many.
Well, that is how things then erupted in that morning. But But on, why that night, there's also just the notion that there was a breakdown in the payoff system. And so the mafia and the police were always in cahoots, but of course the police wanted more money and the mafia wanted to pay off as little as possible. And when the arrangements would break down, then there would be a raid. And then the police just raided periodically anyway. And if they were on good terms with the mafia, they would provide advance notice. So the right mafiosos and their allies and friends wouldn't be there and be caught up in the raid. But that night, there was a decision made to raid the bar. There's a little bit of a mystery about why it was actually not the local precinct right there, but the next precinct over, suggesting perhaps some advanced plan by a higher up. But the way most accounts go is it seems like undercover police went in, 2 men, 2 women, to kind of case out the joint, see what was going on. And they hoped, of course, always to develop an evidentiary base for future cases, so to witness illegal activities. Then 2 of them left the bar, met up with police officers outside the bar who were planning on the raid, and then they basically invaded the bar. And as was typical, by then it was the early morning hours of the 28th. So it was actually really, some accounts talk about the 27th. It was people going out the evening of the 27th, but then by the time the raid started, it was the early morning hours of the 28th. And as was typical in these raids, they asked for everybody, they identified themselves, the police officers, they asked everybody for their identifications. They started harassing and rounding up the managers, the bartenders, anybody who was quote unquote cross-dressed, people who didn't have proper IDs, and that would often include undocumented people, anybody who talked back, fought back, showed attitude. Most people, though, were allowed to leave the bar, and they became the center of a crowd that grew, supplemented by people who were just walking by and people in nearby bars who had begun to hear about what was going on. And the crowd outside grew while there were still a few dozen people in the bar. And then as the police tried to escort those who were in custody into the police wagons, often called paddy wagons, but I learned in the course of my research that actually originates as an anti-Irish slur, so we should really be using that without quotation marks. But escorting those in custody to the police wagons, the crowd began to erupt, throwing coins, throwing bricks, rocking the police wagon. And then we don't, there's so many different accounts through oral histories and the sources at the time of what actually triggered the larger eruption. Some say it was people who were in the wagons freeing themselves, physically fighting back against the police. Others say it was people in the crowd who were crying gay power and throwing coins to symbolize that payoff system at the bar, trying to light the bar on fire. And then I think the best accounts indicate that the police might have been about to shoot out the windows at the crowd when reinforcements arrived. They had called for police reinforcements, and finally the reinforcements arrived and began to help secure first the bar itself and then the surrounding streets. But then what ensued, right, days, nights, especially 3 nights, but lasting over the course of a week of street rioting and street protests.
And how many people came down for those? Like, when did it really become something different than we thought it would be?
I think in a couple of hours after that moment of eruption, that's when it was at its most intense. The second night was another night of eruption as tensions were really high on the streets. And to some extent, a different group of people, wanted to show up to see what was going on that second night. Then things apparently quieted down for a few nights. There were still kind of skirmishes, but low level, and then a final eruption a few days later. And again, there are intense fights about who rioted and who started the riots, but the answer is not necessarily the same each of the nights, right? And the answer is not necessarily the same who was in the bar, who instigated the riot, who then played leading roles in the rioting that developed later.
Mark, a friend of mine was there that night, and I was talking to her last night in anticipation of our conversation with you, and she said from her perspective, she lived on the street, she is a gay woman, and from her perspective, she went out, she had the right documentation, she left. And she said what it was protest that became riot. And so, you know, when we think about what's happening in our world today and the importance and everything that's happened this summer, the complexity of the moment where people were wanting to stand up and you know, did you learn in your documentation that there were people who were coming to advocate and support, and then the complexity of the political forces as we are seeing, right? The mafia with
We're not equating Stonewall with
no, we're not. No, we're not. But it's how a moment can catch on fire, because I think for contemporary audiences that aren't old enough to know, this happens and a group of people is being used and persecuted for somebody else. There's another.
Yes.
That's all.
Yeah, I do think it's very complicated because, of course, there are activists, and then there are just members of communities who are not particularly politicized and maybe engage in everyday what we might call everyday acts of resistance, but aren't part of an organized political movement. And so, I think the accounts of the night of the riot suggest that there were a few political activists who were really mobilized and organized who were there. But it was especially the subsequent nights when they began to show up and try to harness the energy on the streets. And that included activists who had been involved in the smaller homophile movement of the 1960s, but then also a whole array of people who had worked on other movements, the anti-war movement, the counterculture, the women's movement, the Black Power movement, and who saw this as a kindred moment and wanted to help bring the energy and the ideas of those other movements into the LGBT resistance. So there were so many different things happening simultaneously. And, so there were some people politicized prior to the Stonewall, some people who were politicized right in that moment, and then others who became politicized, which is really how we go from several days of protests and demonstrations, and if we want to call them riots, that week, to a mass movement in the 1970s that really dwarfed what had existed in the 60s.
Was it time? Was this a confluence of forces, but it was time for it to happen?
I think in many respects, I think globally 1968, right, stands as one of those years in world history where there's both revolution and repression happening, and people talk about Prague Spring and revolution in Paris, and so much going on, including at the Democratic National Convention in the United States. So, we don't have to be too precise about chronology to see June 1969 really as part of 1968 in that larger symbolic sense. So I do think there was a lot going on, and the timing was really critical. So the LGBT movement had existed and it had radicalized to some extent in 64, 65, 66, but it still hadn't caught on to become a mass movement. And that took a spark, and that turned out to be the Stonewall spark.
Kyle, did you have a question? Kyle, who works with us, he runs our social media department, but he is very interested in this topic. Do you have a question?
I had a few, but I just wanted to dig in a little bit more on what you were talking about with the idea of gay bars as safe spaces within the context of the pandemic. Because as you probably know, a lot of people within our community are just discussing about how the closure of a lot of those spaces is going to sort of have an impact on our gathering spaces in the future. So I wonder if you could talk about that within the context of this moment right now.
Yeah, and I think the risks to gay bars have been growing. The threats to gay bars have been growing for several years, right? And we've seen that also with other queer businesses like gay bookstores. City after city have lost their historic gay bookstores, and there have been recent bar closings in San Francisco, where I live, that predate COVID, right? And so COVID is, in a sense, now enhanced and exacerbated underlying problems. And there's a lot of ideas about why the queer economy has been experiencing those troubles. I mean, some people point to the larger declines of queer neighborhoods. And it's certainly an active conversation here in San Francisco that the irony that with greater acceptance and greater inclusion, people feel less compelled to congregate in terms of where they live. And that has led to ideas that the gayborhoods are all declining in a lot of US cities. And then that reduces the support for queer businesses. I think that some are going to survive, and I think what we're seeing really in the era of COVID is a horrible scientific experiment about adaptability of businesses, and bars have a hard time, I think, compared, say, to a lot of restaurants have been able to shift to takeout, and as difficult as a time they're having. Some, at least, I think, are going to make it because they've been able to shift their business model. It's harder with bars because while it's true some are trying to have takeout cocktails, I don't think the possibilities for that are as great. And then, of course, bars functioned so importantly as social gathering spots, and that's not, of course, not possible, during the pandemic. So. It'll be interesting to see. I guess on the other side, your question is just making me think about this. Rents are going to be declining. Commercial and residential rents are going to be declining in big American cities. So maybe that's going to open up. I don't tend to look at the world through rose-colored glasses, but maybe that's going to open up possibilities for businesses that have been struggling because in places like San Francisco and New York, the rents have been so prohibitive.
Do you find that some of that energy is moving online? Are communities forming online?
Yeah, absolutely. Whether that's just sexual communities and sexual hookups, or more social and political communities, and that does pose a real threat to physical spaces. In my little corner of the universe where we focus so much on history and archives, there's been a similar dynamic. My work's made possible by a network of a few dozen LGBT archives that have existed in the United States now, stretching back for a few decades. But more and more of those materials are being put online and digitized and put online. And so I had to ask myself, actually, in producing an old-fashioned book on Stonewall, about the obvious alternative, which is to put all of those to digitize all of those materials and make them available in that form. I still think there's something special about physical books, and I think there's still something special about physical archives. And I think we need, in my corner of the universe, we are having intense conversations about digitization of historical materials is great because of how democratizing it can be. So many more people can gain access to those materials, but then there are gatekeepers about who, that determine what gets digitized and what doesn't. So from my first book on Philadelphia, identified a magazine called Drum as the most widely circulating gay magazine in the second half of the 1960s. Drum was successful because it combined elements of physique magazines with the elements of the more respectable print-based homophile movement magazines. So it had sexy boys on the cover, sexy men on the cover, and then a lot of political print content inside. Well, Drum hasn't been digitized. And the much more respectable LGBT periodicals of the 60s and 70s have been digitized. So now when I have students who want to research, well, how was the queer media covering this or that in the era, they end up with a biased based on what's digitized, right? And then what's hidden in archives, right? And Drum is a great example of that.
I mean, this is an important question just for memory. It seems that it should be both. You should both be able to keep an archive and put them online, because there's certain places where just all the information will disappear if it's not documented in some new way, I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
That I think that's absolutely right, and that is how we're all moving forward. But there invariably end up being choices that we make, as I had to make with the Stonewall book. Do I just do an online exhibit or do I do a, do I do a, I hate to call it an old-fashioned book, physical book, and I've done a lot of online exhibits over the course of my career, and I think they're really valuable. And for this project, I envisioned it as something that could be used in classrooms, so I wanted it in book format. And I think book format, I don't know about all of you, but online I tend to skim it really fast. Whereas with a book, I slow down, and I want to encourage that, right? With these valuable.
Yeah, you could write lines in, and
I have a question, Mark, around, bringing this sort of rigor, historical rigor to, the work that you're doing, the academic rigor here, and how important it is in terms of the context, again, of our history, of our collective American history. We are working really hard right now. A lot is being made known around Black history, African-American history. We're going to work towards hopefully Indigenous peoples, but how much of the queer community and gay history is, I'm going to use a word, please, in quotes, mainstream? Should people study that? Like, how important is it to the fabric of our society?
Right. Well, I can think, I'm old enough now in my 50s to be able to think back about how history education has then developed over the last 30 or so years. And I know in my college classes, African American history was definitely being incorporated in a serious and fundamental way. I went to a progressive liberal arts college, Wesleyan in Connecticut, so I don't know if that was happening everywhere. But
wait a minute, so did Kyle.
Oh,
all right.
Okay.
You go to Wesleyan?
I don't think you guys were in the same class, but
no. But I just want to say, and half the people probably recording this podcast as well. But anyway,
yeah.
Yeah, we have a big Kyle mafia. We have a big.
Don't use mafia, but yes, population.
I know there's actually a number of them were in at Wesleyan around the time I was there. So
yeah.
You can imagine who I'm talking about if I'm in my 50s.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Black history was being taken seriously, and you could seek out women's history, but there was no Latinx history, no Indigenous history, no disability history, and no LGBT history. I got a little taste of it because I had a mentor in college who was an early gay historian and began encouraging me to pursue my interests in that field, but it was really limited. And so then I go to graduate school in '89 in Philadelphia at the University of Pennsylvania. And I had chosen it because my supervisor there was a groundbreaking lesbian historian. And her classes, of course, did well with queer history, but almost none of the other classes did anything with LGBT history. So now, moving forward to today, 2021, although I know people are joking about how we're still living in 2020, but I teach a history of sexuality course at my university. I did at my last university in Toronto, but I'm not confident that queer history is, say, incorporated into the introduction to US history or the courses that all of my colleagues teach. I think some of them do, but I think many of them do not. And, we're all in California, right? So it's very impressive that California a few years ago passed legislation mandating the teaching of LGBT and disability history in K through 12. And several other states have passed similar laws now. So I think that's going to set an important foundation moving forward. But I know friends and colleagues who have worked on the implementation of the FAIR Act have emphasized that there's a big gap between having a law that says you have to teach this and then developing the curriculum and getting every school district in every part of the state to actually do what they're legally obliged to do. But interestingly, there's no similar thing in post-secondary, in colleges and universities. So it's all, and academic freedom means that it's very difficult for any of us to tell our colleagues what to teach in their classes. We don't have fixed curricula, right? So I hope moving forward, there's going to be a lot of improvement. And I think there's a lot of well-intentioned college and university history faculty who want to do better, but it does take a production of good resource materials, good short 10-minute video clips that can be incorporated into classes, those kinds of things to change the situation.
So when you, as a historian, look back at Stonewall, when at the time, it may not necessarily seem like a significant thing. How important is it to you know, our stories, our, you know, our, how we develop these rights? How important is it to be at the beginning that we had this event?
Right. Well, I think on the one hand, I think if we're going to teach anything about LGBT history, we should probably teach Stonewall. You know, historians each would have their own top 10 list, but I think Stonewall would make most queer historians' top 10 lists of things that ought to be taught in, say, high school, college, university classes. And then there's a question of, okay, well, it should be taught, but what was its significance and how was it important and how do we understand that? And I had a student a few years ago, in some respects, he was the inspiration of the book as well, who wanted to do a paper. He was a photojournalism student at SF State, San Francisco State. And he said, you know, I want to look at how the media covered Stonewall and then what photographs were included in the stories. And I think he imagined, as many people imagined, oh, surely it was front page news in all the New York papers, and surely it was covered on television, and surely, you know, Newsweek and U.S. News and World Report and Time Magazine and Life must have all covered it. Well, not at all. The coverage in the New York papers was buried, short, a few paragraphs. The Voice covered it prominently. The queer press covered it prominently, but mainstream press did not, and the national magazines didn't begin to cover it until the fall. So, the television, national television media didn't cover it at all. So when we think about what was its immediate impact, it was actually pretty slight. And I think many of us believe that what turned Stonewall, the historical event, into the iconic Stonewall that even President Obama could mention in the same breath as Selma and Seneca Falls, was the fact that 1 year later, there started to be what we now call gay pride marches or pride marches to commemorate the anniversary of Stonewall. And that meant that first in a few cities, and then in dozens, and then hundreds of cities, there was an annual commemoration. And even though I think by now many people don't even realize that we're actually doing pride marches in late June or July to commemorate an actual historical event, I think many people do know that, even if their knowledge of it is pretty vague. So on that level, Stonewall became Stonewall months or years or even decades later, right? And so that's part of the kind of the memory making and the process of commemoration, changing the way an event is tracked and documented and interpreted.
Were there photographs of those early marches?
There were definitely photographs of the early marches, but another interesting thing about Stonewall, if you go online, and this is another reason that I wanted to do a physical book, if you go online and do searches for Stonewall, half of the photographs that will come up are not from Stonewall. And they're often mischaracterized and mislabeled as being Stonewall photographs. I first realized this when I kept coming across a photograph in the research that I was doing. And since I was born in '63, so too young really to remember Stonewall, but I have a keen sense of young people's fashion sensibilities. And I noticed that photograph, everybody looks very late 70s to me and not late 60s. And sure enough, I did a little digging, and it's not a Stonewall photo. And then another of the photographs that circulates widely is actually from a film, you know, that tried to recreate the riots. So my book includes 10 or so photographs. There was the only photograph that really captured confrontation between protesters and the police was published in the Daily News. New York Daily News, and we don't have the original. So what you see are kind of grainy newsprint images. Then there was a staged photograph by the journalist, the photographer Fred McDara. We often see those, but those were on I think the second or third nights, and they are clearly staged photographs. So one should not imagine that McDara was just, you know, walking along and caught the scene. That was not exactly what happened. And anyway, there were a few other journalists on the scene. So we have some pictures from that period, but
It's
we
like,
have to be skeptical about what you find online. I mean, I even found that when I was interviewed when the book came out by a number of media outlets, they often wouldn't consult with me about what images they were going to use alongside the interview, and then I cringed when I saw fake photos alongside the interview that people.
Mark, it struck me before Jesse came on. I don't even think Kyle was on. The way that you endeavored to do this project was really so thoughtful, but it gave a lot of credit to the end user, to the student, to the reader, to have some critical thinking around what you're reading and being able to put history together and like to discern what is fact, what is legend, mythology, whatever.
Right.
And how do you feel right now how are you feeling around having faith, really? I mean, you yourself seem to have critical thinking, but how do we have faith that whatever that skill is surviving?
Yeah. No, it is a very intense moment. And your question immediately makes me think about, I don't know when this is going to air, but of course, we're taping the week of the riots at the Capitol. And every day, it seems, we're getting new visual images of the confrontations that occurred that day and the violence that occurred that day. And it's changing perspectives on what happened. And yet, it's the first set of images that often have the greatest impact because they set the script for the later the later interpretations. So, this is the kind of thing we try to teach in history classrooms, and a lot of it is also just everyday wisdom about not trusting single accounts and not trusting single perspectives. I get a little nervous actually in all the talk right now about trust facts and trust science and trust truth. And I think there's a lot to that, of course, but there are multiple truths, right? And there are multiple accounts. And I think with Stonewall, I think I try to emphasize most people now are developing their accounts based on oral histories, and oral histories are incredibly valuable, but I can't see why we would trust those and ignore the several dozen print material accounts that we have from the moment. And we really have to lay those things alongside one another. And similarly, as I think as we digest what just happened at the Capitol, we're going to have to lay alongside one another all of the visual images, all the narrative accounts, all of the oral histories to try to come up with some perspective. But I will tell you, the book has been criticized by some for having a repetitive quality because I do print a couple of dozen accounts of the Stonewall Riots. Well, of course there's repetition, but I also want to encourage people, notice the Times used the word homosexual and the Voice used both homosexual and queen. And what does that tell us, right, about how journalists translate developments for different audiences, right? And what does it mean that the trans periodicals actually of 1969, there were a few, ignored Stonewall, and the gay periodicals played up the role of trans people at the riots? I mean, that's not what we would necessarily expect given today's political climate, where I think at least many of my students would say, oh, the trans periodicals, newspapers, newsletters must have celebrated the trans role in the riots, and the gay newspapers and magazines must have ignored the trans role. Well, actually, it's the opposite, and what do we do with that, right? So I think and I recognize, of course, not everybody's going to have the patience to read 24 accounts of the same event. But that's what we have to encourage as an attitude, right? About how we acquire wisdom, and rather than just repeating one person's account of what happened.
Kyle, do you have a last question?
I do. I was just gonna ask about sort of the fact that a lot of people outside of our community have this mentality that since the Supreme Court decision around marriage equality in 2015, that it's like, okay, we're done. there's nowhere else to go. And so I was just wondering, based on the work that you've done around the history of our community, what do you think that history can teach us about sort of the future of sort of the movement? As you
Right.
know, all the violence against the trans community and just a lot of the army bans, the policy things still happen. But I'm wondering what you think sort of history can help inform about sort of what the future of this could look like.
Right, right. Well, you kind of history 101 for graduate history students is to question all progress narratives, because we have, especially in the United States, this faith in progress, that things are always getting better. And there's even the version of that in civil rights history is, you know, the arc of justice bends toward freedom, and a faith that things will always improve and improve in linear and steady ways. And I think there's not much we can thank Trump and the Trump administration for, but I think actually we can credit Trump and the Trump administration for serving as a reminder that progress is not linear. It's not. There were great gains in some respects in the preceding years, but those could be erased, whether it's trans service in the military or understandings of sex, gender, and sexuality in civil rights law. Or any, you know, in any number of areas. So, you know, progress to whatever extent it occurs, I think we increasingly should realize it can be very fragile and very vulnerable. And then progress for some does not necessarily mean progress for others. So I will confess I'm married to my partner and we avail ourselves of the privileges and benefits that come with that. But I think you know, there's also been, I think, increased consciousness about the discrimination against the unmarried and how many social benefits in our country get attached to marriage, just as we attach healthcare to employment, rather than understanding those benefits as being deserved by everybody, right? And so, you know, I think marriage equality, I think, is an improvement over marriage inequality. But what about the discrimination now against the unmarried, right? And how do we want to address that moving forward? Even on issues like immigration or healthcare, right? Two benefits that in our society often get attached to marriage, right? And what does that do to people who don't want, for whatever reason, or aren't able to access legal marriage? So, you know, I think there's so many ways to qualify and question the queer progress narrative. And I think that doesn't mean saying, oh, there's an opposite problem too, right? Because the opposite problem is, oh, things used to be great and now they're horrible. I sometimes think this is just an expression of a personality type. You know, we all know those kind of people, nostalgic for the golden age of the past, and now things have gone completely wrong. And if one adopts that perspective in each and every situation, you know, that's a problem too. So I think we have to test, has there really been progress? For whom? What are we defining as progress, right? And similarly, what are we defining? How are we conceptualizing declension or decline? And then come to evaluations and assessment on a case-by-case basis. So that's how I would.
So, Marc, this has just been an incredible conversation, and we're just so appreciative that you chose to spend some time with us. I really, really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me and for asking such great questions and having such a great conversation.
Priscilla or Kyle, do you guys want to say something?
No, just thank you so much. It's been wonderful to have you here. There's so much to think about, And in particularly for me, the idea that there are many truths, you know, there are many point of views, or there may be one, and Jesse and I have been talking about that idea for many, many years. You know, it's one's frame, it's one's point of view. And how can we take multiple points of view and still live in a society that's decent and kind? You know, it's complicated. So these are really challenging ideas that you're having us think about. But thank you for your great work.
Yeah, Kyle.
Well, just thank you for your time, and thank you to Priscilla's point, thank you for the work that you do every day in promoting queer education for, you know, the next generation. I think it's really, really important work. So appreciate the fact that you're at the forefront of it, doing it every day.
Thank you, and I'll return the compliment. Thank you for having this platform for talking about these ideas.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. And we're here anytime. You want to come back? We have some new book or something else to talk about. Please keep us in mind.
Okay, I hope you won't regret that.
Okay. Bye, you guys.